An amazing little discovery has been made in the cave mud of northern Vietnam. Some scientists from Budapest, Hungary, were taking soil samples in some North Vietnamese caves, which they sieved and processed to identify any small biological components. This effort to search for small organisms paid off. The scientists discovered a new species of snail that just so happens to be the smallest snail species ever found living on land. And it's honestly really close in size to the smallest snail species ever found in the sea. Named the Angustopila semyon, the snail species has a shell that's less than half a millimeter tall, with an internal volume of just 0.036 cubic millimeters. In a report on the discovery published on the New Scientist website, the author claims that, quote, "The species is so small that you could fit about 5 individuals inside the average grain of sand," unquote. Curiously, the scientists don't think that the snails actually live where they were found. Lead researcher, taxonomist Barna Palgergli said, quote, "We assumed that the sediment had fallen in through crevices in the rock because it contains bleached, opaque shells of surface-dwelling terrestrial gastropods. The living snails presumably live deep in limestone crevices close to or on root systems," unquote. Alongside the A. semyon in Vietnam, the researchers also discovered another tiny, but not record-breaking tiny snail in cave systems in Laos that they named the Angustopila coprologos. This snail is particularly odd because it appears to deposit some kind of material, which the authors speculate could possibly be its own feces, in narrow rows of small clumps or dots along the outer surface of its shell. Lead author, Mr. Palgergli, speculates that these deposits may be camouflage, but he noted that these snails are so small and they live in such confined spaces within crevices and rock that what would they even need camouflage for? After all, who's hunting them in such confined habitats? Mr. Palgergli said, quote, "If not camouflage, then what?" It was surprising to see that in the face of their extremely small size, these tiny snails have complex behavioral mechanisms that evolved as a response to certain environmental factors that we know nothing about, unquote. Okay, so this is really fascinating. These extremely small snails live in such extremely confined habitats that their life strategy and ecology and even their evolutionary context are almost totally unknown to us. You should really check out this paper, because in addition to the systematic descriptions, it has a few great sections on the evolution of snail miniaturization and the granules seen on the snail shell. In these paragraphs, the authors offer speculation as to how snails could have evolved into these habitats and niches. The evolution of miniaturization is particularly fascinating, as the authors talk about minimum viable sizes of snail offspring. In effect, these snails are so tiny that they're pushing the physical limits on how small a complex eukaryotic organism like this can actually be. They're so tiny that their bodies aren't even composed of that many cells, and you need a bare minimum number of cells to sustain a certain level of tissue complexity and functionality. Specifically with these snails, the eggs have to be large enough to be viable, but they also have to be small enough to fit through the body whorl of the shell. This, the authors suggest, is why smaller snails tend to have more globular shells. They need the internal volume to move their eggs along, otherwise they won't even be able to reproduce. The minimum volume of the egg is determined by the minimal numbers of neural cells that a hatchling needs. The egg can be smaller if you sacrifice some of these cells, but then you might end up with a dysfunctional or non-viable hatchling. This is all very fascinating stuff, and it fires up my imagination thinking about how complex life forms can adapt to habitats and ecological niches at these extremely small scales.